Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. This is reflection number 7, and I'm actually recording this after I did 6. So hopefully, that's why I'm dressed the same and look the same. So hopefully, if you're watching on video, but otherwise, if you're listening on the podcast, hopefully I don't sound too dry mouth. That's one of the hardest parts I think right now is I'm having a problem. I've noticed that in some of the episodes, and like what? But okay, so as I've said in other reflections, these are supposed to just be short, sweet. I'm not using notes really, although I am kind of looking at the website here and there because these are based on blog posts or something that I've been thinking about. And so today's, I recently wrote a blog post about the non-aggression principle and the blockade and kind of the Hamas and Israel situation and the walls that they have and all this other stuff that they have there. And then in addition, one of my first blog posts was something, it was like titled The Non-Aggression Principle versus the Golden Rule. Okay, and I've been really thinking about this stuff, not only those two blog posts, but also recently reading For a New Liberty and doing the literature series with that. And then I'm reading for another literature series that we're going to be having soon. I think it's Hans Hoppe or whatever his name is. But he's also a Mises.org person, and he wrote a book that's similar to For a New Liberty, and it discusses the non-aggression principle. And so I'm going to be talking about it again, but I just wanted to talk about sort of my thoughts generally about the non-aggression principle, some of my problems, and then the golden rule, and just the whole situation. And so I guess let me talk, let's just go with that. So first you should know what the non-aggression principle. Well, basically, I've defined it, and I'm basically stealing it off other people, is that it's aggression against another is immoral. Okay, so it's immoral to use aggression against another. And you always have to define each thing. So another is an actual person or his or her property. It's not an animal. It's not, unless it's owned by somebody, and it's not like a plant or something like that. And aggression is the initiation of the use or threat of physical violence. So some people would actually differ on, what exactly is violence. So that's another thing I haven't necessarily defined yet, but I could define it, I suppose, right now as it's actual contact. So it's some sort of contact. It's unwanted, coerced contact. It's unwanted contact, right? Yeah, I think that's probably the better one. And so it has to be physical, okay? It's not a threat. So me saying, it's kind of odd. Again, I'm still kind of in the inner beginning stages of this libertarian, understanding this libertarian concept and anarcho-capitalism and all these other anarcho-syndicalism, which is sort of like the progressive view of anarchy, I guess. And I'm still trying to understand all this stuff. It's kind of complicated. It's all new, but it's fun too because it's really interesting. But I was listening to Ben Stone. I've been talking about him a lot, and this will probably be one of the last times that I mention him with this type of discussion. And he's a great podcaster, great show. He probably gets a whole lot more listens than I do. I'm a nobody compared to him, and he's a nobody compared to Stephen Molyneux. So I'm sure there's different levels here. But he in one podcast recently he had said, if he makes fun of somebody, that's violence. Like that's initiation of violence. Like if someone said something to him about his mom or something, or about his weight, or about his beard, like you have and he said something mean, then that allows you in self-defense, because once you're not allowed to initiate aggression, but once the aggression's initiated on you, you then have some natural right, I suppose, that if you wanted to, that you could then respond with aggression. And it has to be proportional. I've defined it as both proportional or reasonable. So not both. So it has to be either or. And I've done that because after looking at the Israel conflict and trying to understand the non-aggression principle, I've had a lot of problems with it. And I guess, so I have a lot of problems with talking, because I don't think talking can necessarily, I don't think there's any level of where that can be an initiation of aggression. Of physical violence, right? So now if we take out physical and we just say the aggression is the initiation of the use or threat of violence, then, you can open up the door to say, name calling is violence. You could even say price gouging. See, and this is why I don't use this, because you would then say price gouging, charging too much, that's violence. Let's put our thinking caps here. I think you could reasonably make a decent argument. Someone could, let's say this was the law of the land. because you'll hear me talk about this later on about my problems with the non-aggression principle, but let's say it was the law of the land somehow. Well, I could definitely see, you're always going to have people, even libertarians and even anarchists, they're going to differ on these definitions because it is sort of subjective. It's not objective. We're trying to create this objective standard, but it's not. It is by far not. And I've understood that coming up with examples of like spanking or name calling or raising a child, which is practically impossible without using aggression, defined the way I say. Of course, you don't have to use mental violence. You don't have to, just, make fun of them or doing. Yeah, of course you don't have to do that. But do I have to pick her up to put her in the bathtub when it's time for a bath? Yeah. And then I've kind of talked about this, I think, in other episodes or maybe a literature series, I think. But you're still initiating aggression because it's contact, right? So even by its most, both Ben and I would both agree that because it's contact, unwanted contact, at that point, then it would be aggression. And so you'd be violating it. And so it just seems kind of weird. So I've had problems with that. And then when I was looking at the whole Hamas and Israel thing, and I'm thinking, one of the hardest part, and it's really unfortunate with the blog post, because what I really wanted to do with the blog post was just make you look at the images of these walls that Israel built around Gaza, and just understand how you live under that. Like, that has to have some negative psychological impact that we don't even discuss. We simply think because they're Hamas, and because they've claimed that they want to, and they say it in their charter, that they want to have the end of Israel, that they're evil. We declare, it's official foreign U.S. policy, that they're terrorists. Why? I don't necessarily understand. I mean, I can understand, but at the same time I can't, because if you look at the blockade, and if you look at the pictures of prior 1947 or whenever the UN partition, where they actually kind of created the state of Israel, it was all Palestinian land. Then the United Nations, backed by the United States, backed by Britain, backed by Europe, came in and said, no, this is your land. We're going to give it to you. And so, of course, we can have this. We could have a huge episode on who actually owns the land, okay? I have no idea. I'm not even going to. I didn't even try to get into that. You could do that as well. But regardless, prior to 1947, and I'm sure for at least the period of adverse possession of, I don't really even know property. I'm still into this. I don't know how long you have to homestead land to own it under anarcho-capitalism or under some sort of no government rule. I have no idea. I would assume it'd have to be some time period and not just one day. Otherwise, you're going to have so many conflicting titles and stuff like that. But I'm sure whatever the private agency would create some sort of thing. And maybe it would be similar to adverse possession, which I think is based sort of on common law. So maybe it would be 7 years, maybe it would be 20, which has its own problems because that's a long time to have to homestead a land in order to claim it as your own. So I don't know. Maybe it would just be a day, and then you'd have even more conflicts because, again, oh, it's my land today, it's yours tomorrow. Oh, it's mine today, and then we're just going back and forth. But then again, we're kind of assuming that everyone would fight. But then again, I mean, if it's land, you're going to try to build a house on it, right? And if someone tries to build a fence and it goes on your land, then you could have issues. But I don't know. So I'm getting really off topic there. So, but I didn't want to talk about that in the blog post or in this reflection. But bottom line is that it was still sort of Palestinian land. Let's just assume that, right? Maybe at a time it was Israeli land, so there could still be an issue there. But so at that point, the UN comes in and says, "This is your land. It's not their land." And then, but they do give them a little bit. They give them a little tiny bit. And then Israel has these little settlement expansions, and they continue to get bigger and bigger, and they just kind of invade, similar to the children coming from Mexico and Honduras into Texas, right? And that's sort of a joke. But so they're invading this land, and now the Palestinians, whether in Hamas or whatever, in Gaza, and in the West Bank too, it's actually shrunk. The size of their land has shrunk quite considerably. And not only that, but Israel does a lot of bad stuff, first of all. I mean, they serve like no warrant. They do all the SWAT team stuff that we do in America times 10. They just go to random homes, enforce these warrants and stuff and just arrest family members. And yeah, it could be justified, I guess. And this is where I kind of get into some questions here, okay? And I didn't even bring that up in the blog post, but just issues with understanding self-defense and how far you can take it. So, and then what I did in the blog post was I said, oh, okay, let me talk one more time. And then there's also Israel build the walls. So they built this blockade. And not only did they build walls that surrounds Gaza, so it's impossible to go in and out, and that's why they built these tunnels. It's not just to bring weapons in, it's actually to bring items, because Israel controls this stuff. They say who can come in, who can come. Imagine our borders, sort of, when you go through customs, and if you want to bring an item in, it's the same thing, except, which is bad in a way, right? Like, we should be angry about that. But what they do in Israel is they say you can only have these 33 items. You can only have this certain amount of items, okay? You can't have toys because it could be dangerous. You can't have other items. You can't have cement. You can't have a wheelchair. You can't have certain items because it could potentially be used as a weapon and hurt us. And not only that, but then even in the water, because of course Gaza is right there kind of on the Mediterranean Sea or whatever's right there. It's going to make me sound stupid if that's not what it is. But right there, the Navy of Israel actually contains them there as well. And there's this very small strip, I think it's like a few miles or 1 or 4 miles maybe, where Gazans are allowed to go through. But even then, they're still under the sort of control of Israel. So basically, it's sort of like an apartheid. It's basically like a concentration camp is basically what it is. There's no way around that. And I was thinking, well, is that proper self-defense? And so what I did in the blog post was I kind of made two arguments. I said, well, because it all really depends. If you're applying the non-aggression principle, it all depends on who initiates the aggression, right? Because it's aggression, and that's the initiation of the use or threat of physical violence. So you have to look at who initiates it. Now, of course, it's probably impossible, really in almost any, especially foreign policy situation, to actually be able to understand who, in fact, is the first aggressor. You know, when we look in America and what we do, you know, even 9/11, you know, that's a big emotional topic. You know, it's a few days after, you know, today, and even that, you know, who's the aggressor there? Is it the people from Saudi Arabia who went on the plane and crashed in the building, if indeed that happened, right? Or I at this point believe it did, or is it America going over into Saudi Arabia and having military bases right near on, you know, a religious land? You know, what's the initiative of aggression there? And I don't know how to answer, like, who is the initiative, you know, what happened before that? I don't know. Had we been bombed before that? And I think we had. But then what happened before that? And what happened before that? And, like, who is even we? Like, is it the state? Is it Britain then at that point, if it was something that had happened prior to 1791? You know, we're getting into really, you know, tricky kind of territory there. And so, but I did Hamas, I did Israel, and I said, you know, let's assume that it was Hamas who did it in this first instance. And they kind of went back and forth and bombed and bombed and bombed and bombed. But then there was one step where Israel kind of, you know, it's supposed to be, I put reasonable or proportional. And the reason I put or is because if it's proportional, what that means is that it's kind of got to be equivalent. It doesn't have to be the same thing, but it's got to be something the same. And I kept thinking about, like, let's say somebody bombed your house, but you were completely broke, okay? And you had no money, you had no ability to build a bomb. And so what could you do in response? Could you take it up like a bit of level? Or could you do something that's not exactly equivalent? Like, I don't know what would be equivalent. Maybe you turn the water off to that house of the people who bombed you. To me, that would be, like, let's say it killed your family, okay? To me, that would be reasonable, but it wouldn't be proportional. And, you know, is your really only solution in self-defense just to use a bomb onto them? Now, of course, you don't have to do any of this, and I would suggest not doing any of this, right? Definitely not. But you can understand in certain circumstances where there'd be people who would be really sad and hurt, and they'd want to do something. And I kept thinking, and that, to me, that was thinking about Israel, too, is like, okay, so they took it up another step. And not only did they invade and do the settlements, but they put the walls around it. They put the blockade. They said, you know, you can only have these items. They've put them in a concentration camp. And to me, that's definitely not proportional by any means, right? I don't even think we have to discuss that. And it's not reasonable at all either. Okay? And I don't see it. So it fails both of those tests. So it's not self-defense to me. And then I did the same thing. Well, if it was Israel that had started it, well, it comes to the same conclusion, basically. It doesn't matter because Hamas doesn't have the capability because of its GDP and basically because Israel controls it. It puts it in a situation where it can't really respond in any level to the degree that Israel could. And it would be the same, and here's a good point. It would be the same thing if that, let's say it was the United States that aggressed on Saudi Arabia. Could they then fly a plane, and could that be a self-defense mechanism? Like, I don't know. And then it brings up and I'm saying that because they don't have the ability, because the equivalent nature of it would be to build a military base here. I mean, that's not going to happen. So they've got to do something else. And that's where I bring the reasonableness. And I'm definitely not going to argue that I don't think that's reasonable to fly a plane into towers and kill 3,000 innocent people. No, by any means, no, definitely not. But you do have to at least think critically about what could be the appropriate response that they could do and not violate the non-aggression principle and go beyond what they are permitted under self-defense, right? And even all this is sort of arguable if you don't think that we actually aggressed on them by moving into Saudi Arabia. And then I suppose it depends if Saudi Arabia consented to us having military bases there, well, then what about that? So you have a lot of issues. And so when I kept thinking about this, and I've had my problems with non-aggression principle, and when I did the Ferguson story, there was like two blogs, I think I wrote one blog entry, I did 2 episodes, and at that point I was like, you know what, I just can't, I'm not going to talk about Ferguson anymore. We've already given up. I haven't heard anything about it. I think they maybe put cameras on them, but nothing's changed. And it's not, why? Because nobody there votes. It's 6% of the black population votes. Okay, so don't expect to have a ton of black people on the police force if you're not going to vote. I mean, it's that simple. It's that simple. At least under the state and government that we are under today. Okay. And you can move and you can do other stuff, right? And that's all problematic, right? But yeah, what are you going to do? And so basically I'm at the point, and I've been working on this for the past two or 3 months now, I suppose, that I think the better philosophy is the golden rule, because the bottom line, and that's basically treat everyone the way you would want to be treated. And I think it answers everything. It answers all these problems, really. And you can, of course, use, and I'm kind of getting into like 2 different things here, because with the non-aggression principle, to me, what it is, it's a philosophy that's best applied to the state. So if you do have to have a state, they should apply the non-aggression principle, right? In order to protect people's property, whatever, even if you could somehow, they actually do that without actually hurting people's property, right? So that's still arguable. But if you had to have the state, I think the framework suggested by Murray Rothbard and all this other stuff about that, libertarian axiom of the non-aggression principle is the best way. And I think he even kind of argued that in For New Liberty. He's like, well, if you're going to have the state, let's at least adhere to this non-aggression principle. But then again, even under the non-aggression principle, we can argue of what violence is. And I'm sure you could understand how there'd be an opposite side, especially if it's paid interests and, special interests who are, providing money and providing support, and we're not voting a certain way to get those people out of office. Well, then they're going to keep doing what they're going to do, and they're going to change what they think violence is. What is physical violence? Or if it wasn't physical violence, well, then it's violence. Well, then shoot. Price gouging, illegal. Child labor, illegal. That's violence, right? This is what they'd argue. And I think a Supreme Court that's going to rule in favor of the government would rule for it. It's not, there's nothing different. But that's why you would have physical violence. But even then, you still have your problem, right? So I'm not saying you wouldn't have a problem with the state, but I think it would be better than what we have today, assuming you could adhere to the physical violence standard of the non-aggression principle and aggression, right? But even then, you have to look at the example with Hamas and all that stuff. And like, what if you could make an argument that the walls or the blockade or something like that was reasonable, or some sort of, again, you have the court working for you, so they could argue that that's reasonable. Well, that's where I think the golden rule is the better rule. And I think it's the better rule for many reasons, also because it's easy. It's much easier to understand. Again, when I'm writing this blog post, I just made it too confusing that I don't think anybody read it, and I don't think anybody would want to read it. But then you can read some of my other articles that get more reads and more likes, and you can understand the differences between the two. It's just easier to grasp. And so it's made me realize that I think, and what I'm going to continue to do in future blog and other episodes, is just I'm going to focus on the golden rule. I think it's the better solution. Like, because if I'm thinking, would I want to be in a situation where there's walls around me? Like, yeah, maybe they did, shoot some bombs at us and kill 30 of our people, and we have 1 million or so. But still, I wouldn't want to live under that condition. So I would rather do this. Like, this would be my solution instead. Would I want someone to pick me up and put me into a bathtub if I was a little child? Well, yeah, I would, because I want to be clean. Would I want someone to pick me up and put me in, these are violations of the non-aggression principle, right? And so when you apply the golden rule, it applies. I mean, because you're okay with that. Would I want to be punched by someone? No. So it's both violates non-aggression principle and it violates the golden rule. And it reminds me a lot, because I've been thinking a lot about this. It reminds me of Ron Paul, and it reminds me of why I got into the libertarian understanding of philosophy and all that stuff to begin with. It was really because of him, I suppose, and many things, like I've discussed in other episodes. But he always did that, like especially when he talked about foreign policy. He would apply this golden rule in kind of a slick way where he'd say, well, would you want a drone flying over your head all the time? Would you want to be bombed? If Mexico did this and if Russia, put a military base in Mexico, would we be okay with that? Cuba, if they put nuclear bombs or warships around Cuba, would we be angry? I think we were, actually, right? And so we should apply that same reasoning, like the non-aggression. Why am I going to have to analyze the non-aggression principle of at the point of when Russia starts sending warships into Cuba, the area of Cuba? Like why? It's not important to me. It's the golden rule. If we're going to do it, then it's okay for him to do it. Like, I see no problem there, right? So I don't know. And I guess maybe you could change all this whole discussion if we didn't do that stuff. If we did treat people the way we want to be treated, but then we would be treating them the way we want to be treated, and we wouldn't want to do it any other way, right? So I don't know, but that's really what I wanted to talk about, just kind of my journey towards, and I think you're going to hear it in our episodes, because in the episodes, usually what I do is I do the solutions, right? And I say, here's the Democrat, what I'm going to do, I think from now on, is this is Democrat, Republican, and it's usually the same, sometimes different. Here's their solution. Well, often it is different because of political reasons. Then I'm going to give the libertarian solution, and maybe the progressive view, but that's generally going to be the Democratic view, right? Or even Republican sometime. And then I might give, and that's it. I think that's really all I'm going to do. I've been sort of talking about the non-aggression principle in some episodes and some of the the anarchism type of view, but the libertarian view is often the anarchism view. And it's just the difference of whether you're going to apply it to a state court or to a private agency. I mean, that's really the only difference. So I might add that in. Nuisance law, we were talking about that. Well, the libertarian view would say there has to be an invasion of property, right? And that each individual person should be able to claim the right. It shouldn't be the government who can do this. It should be the individual through a class action and all this stuff. But the government, through its laws, has discarded that notion. So, and I talked about that in that episode, but that's how you would solve it. So you could either do it through state courts, or then maybe private courts would have that same sort of concept, because it's all based on common law anyways. Although, of course, again, the government has usurped that whole idea and changed it through the Clean Air Act, for example, which doesn't work in our favor. It works in big business favor, which again, it happens all the time. So that's my problems with it. Hopefully you can think critically about it, because maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Again, I'm still kind of new at this, trying to understand the non-aggression principle, but it seems to me that because there's so many exceptions to it that I've sort of discovered, or because it just seems too complicated. It's really easy, though, at a basic understanding. Yeah, you know what? I shouldn't use force against someone else unless it's self-defense, right? But at the same time, like we were talking with the Brett Veinotte School Sucks podcast thing, which I think this will be the last time I talk about this too, because I've talked about this a lot in previous episodes, is that if a guy's walking on a train track and he's wearing headphones and he's listening to music or whatever, and he doesn't see a train that's coming right towards him, and I push him, I don't want to be immoral. Like, I'm immoral because I pushed the guy? Like, no, that's crazy. And so I apply the golden rule. And I'm not going to pick and choose when I apply the golden rule and when I pick the non-aggression principle. So I'm just going to naturally just pick one. And I think the best one is the golden rule. Would I want to be pushed if a train was coming at me and I didn't see it or hear it? Yeah, hell yeah, it would be. I want to live. Assuming I lived, right? And it'd be unfortunate if the other guy did not live. And you can make an argument, well, there's a self-defense and it's a defense of others. But by golly, you're expanding this, be wary about that, especially if you apply that to the state, because that's the argument of why we're invading Syria. So regardless of how you intervened there, maybe you're the one that makes tells the train, you were the one that loads the train with coal or whatever to make it powered, and then you were leaving work and then you saw the guy training. Well, you in fact sort of kind of contributed to the situation, right? So if we contributed to what happened in Syria some way, not directly, but some ways, although you could argue directly, well then couldn't the same analysis apply? So that's today's reflection. It's a little bit longer than I thought it would be, but that covers up this discussion of the NAP versus the golden rule, and I think I'm pretty much done talking about it. I might have some future blog posts where I might try to talk about non-aggression principle every now and then and apply it to a situation. But I think I'm going to try to make the future blog articles more populist, more like a Ron Paul, but based on the golden rule, based on property rights, and based on sound economics, like Austrian type of stuff, like that. Whether it's anarcho-capitalism or whether it's Austrian economics, just that whole idea, of division of labor and self-ownership. These are fundamentals that I still believe in. And because they make the most sense at this time in my life. So I don't know what it will be like, a year from now, but at this point, that's what I would think. And so that's the reflection, and thank you for listening, and make sure you check out the website, criticalthinkingsrequired.com, as most of the stuff will be continuing to go to the website. And as always, think critically.